So let's talk about something that affects as many as 1 in 10 people, a condition that most of us have never even heard of. It's this profound disconnection from our own emotional world, almost like a kind of internal blindness. Let's dive in.
Have you ever had that feeling? A storm is just brewing inside you. Your chest is tight, your heart is racing, but if someone asks you, hey, what's wrong? You genuinely have no idea what to say. You feel it, but you can't name it. That exact experience is what we're getting into today. And there's a name for it, alexithymia. It sounds complicated, but when you break down its Greek roots, it's actually incredibly straightforward. You've got for lack, lexis for word, and thymos for emotion. So put it all together, and what do you get? It literally means no words for feelings.
Okay, so for our first section, let's really unpack what that means. What does alexithymia actually look like, and what does it feel like for someone who's living with it?
Well, clinically, it really boils down to 4 main things. First, there's a real struggle to even identify what you're feeling and tell it apart from a purely physical sensation, like hunger or pain. Second, even if you have a vague sense of an emotion, trying to describe it to someone else is incredibly difficult. Third, and this is interesting, there's often a very limited inner world of daydreams or fantasy. And finally, a thinking style that's really focused on the outside world, the concrete, trivial details of what's happening, instead of looking inward.
But here's the thing, and this is super important. Alexithymia is not a one-size-fits-all condition. A type I individual, that's your classic cold-blooded stereotype, where both the thinking and the feeling parts are severely impaired. But look at type 2. This is almost the complete opposite. These are people who feel emotions intensely, maybe even more than the average person, but they have absolutely no mental labels for what's happening. They are just overwhelmed by these powerful feelings they can't make any sense of.
Which of course raises a massive question. What is actually going on inside the brain to cause this kind of disconnect? Well, neuroscience is starting to give us some pretty fascinating answers. Okay, so if we take a peek inside the brain with imaging tech, we start to see some really interesting patterns. We see less activity in the amygdala, which is like the brain's main emotion detector. We see issues in the anterior cingulate cortex, which is what helps us become consciously aware of our feelings. And then there's this brilliant paradox with a region called the insula. It's underactive when trying to sense what other people are feeling, but it's overactive, almost screaming, in response to your own internal body signals.
And this leads to something called somatosensory amplification. The best way to think about it is like this. Imagine the brain has a volume dial for all of your internal sensations. A little flutter in your stomach, a slight ache. Well, for someone with alexithymia, that dial is stuck on high. All these normal, low-level body signals get misinterpreted as being super distressing or even alarming because the emotional context that would explain them is just gone.
An early neuropsychological model just puts it perfectly. It describes alexithymia as a sort of functional split brain. You have the right hemisphere, which processes all that raw, nonverbal emotion, the feeling part, but it can't get the message across to the left hemisphere, which is in charge of language and making sense of it all. It's like the call is coming from inside the house, but the phone line is dead.
So where does this all come from? Is it something you're just born with, or is it something that happens to you? Let's dig into the roots of this disconnection.
A massive study of over 8,700 pairs of Danish twins gives us a really clear picture here. Genetics, they account for about 1/3 of the trait. But just look at that huge purple slice. Over half of it, 51%, comes from the non-shared environment. And what is that? It's all the unique, individual life experiences that shape who you are. And it is, by far, the single biggest factor.
And a lot of those experiences happen really, really early. For instance, insecure attachment styles seem to be a major pathway. A child with an avoidant attachment style learns that they have to suppress their emotions to stay close to a parent who might be rejecting. This can lead directly to that externally focused way of thinking. On the other hand, a child with an anxious attachment style might be swamped by these huge, chaotic emotions, which can later turn into that core difficulty identifying what any feeling is.
And then, of course, there's trauma. It's estimated that a staggering 1 in 6 adolescents are affected by childhood trauma. For them, alexithymia isn't really a deficit, it's a defense mechanism. It's a way to emotionally check out in order to survive something unbearable. It's a shield that can stay up long, long after the danger has passed.
All right, let's shift gears now to one of the most groundbreaking areas in all of this research, something that is completely reframing how we think about both autism and empathy.
For decades, one of the defining features of autism was thought to be a lack of empathy. It was just accepted as fact. But the Alexithymia hypothesis comes along and asks this really revolutionary question: what if we've been wrong this whole time? What if the empathy issues we see aren't about autism at all?
And the data is just startling. In the general population, right, about 1 in 10 people have severe alexithymia. But you look at the autistic population, and that number just explodes. It skyrockets to nearly half, or even more in some studies. The overlap is absolutely massive. And that right there is the key to this whole puzzle.
Because this is what happens when you scientifically pull the two things apart. Researchers found that autistic people who don't have alexithymia often show totally normal levels of emotional empathy. That's the ability to actually feel what other people are feeling. Their difficulty is more with cognitive empathy, which is about understanding the why behind the feeling. This is a game changer. It suggests the emotional empathy deficit we've always pinned on autism is actually a feature of the co-occurring alexithymia, not autism itself.
Now, this isn't just some abstract psychological concept, right? This difficulty with emotion has profound, very real-world consequences for a person's health, their career, and their overall well-being.
When you can't process emotions in your head, they have a tendency to show up in your body. We see these huge overlaps with conditions like borderline personality disorder. We see incredibly high rates in addictive behaviors where, substances become a way to manage feelings that you just can't understand. And it's also strongly linked to eating disorders like anorexia and bulimia, where that line between emotional distress and physical hunger gets completely blurred.
And this stuff doesn't just stay at home. It follows you to work. Leaders with high alexithymia are often seen as being cold, aloof, even incompetent, not because of their technical skills, but because of what's called emotional illiteracy. It's also linked to counterproductive behaviors like intentionally hiding information from colleagues. And it's a huge risk factor for burnout, especially in jobs like nursing, where that emotional connection is just part of the job description.
So after all that, here's the big question. If alexithymia is so deeply rooted in our biology and our earliest experiences, can anything actually be done about it? Can someone learn the language of emotion?
And the answer, thankfully, is a pretty hopeful yes. A huge meta-analysis found that, on the whole, psychological therapies really do work. Integrative therapies that kind of mix and match different approaches seem to have the biggest effect, but, other methods like skills-based CBT, psychoeducation, and even expressive arts therapies all show significant positive results. People can get better at describing their feelings and thinking more introspectively.
But, and this is a huge but, that exact same study found that across all of these successful therapies, the effect on the single most fundamental problem, that difficulty identifying feelings in the first place, was almost nothing. A change of negative 0.06. That's basically zero. So we can teach people the vocabulary of emotion, but teaching them how to recognize the feeling as it's happening, that remains the biggest challenge of all.
And this leaves us with a really profound final thought to chew on. What alexithymia shows us is that feeling isn't just one single thing. It's this complex process of sensation, then recognition, then description. So as we get better at understanding and treating this kind of emotional blindness, what else are we going to learn about the very nature of our own consciousness and what it truly, truly means to feel?